It's time to go on the record with WRAL News.
Thanks so much for joining us for On the Record. I'm Lena Tillett. This week, you just can't escape the heat. Not the scorching temperatures, not the conversation about what this heat wave means for the state, the country, and the globe. Tonight, we're going to dive right in with the top climate scientists and activists in North Carolina. First, let's take a look at where we are. So it's been a really hot month in North Carolina. This week, we've seen heat advisories warning people to limit time outdoors. In other parts of the country, it's even worse. Records are being broken for temperature highs in the southern U.S. This week, Dallas, Texas reached 109 degrees for the first time. Oklahoma City, 110 degrees, a nearly 100-year-old record broken there. And Wichita Falls, Texas hit 115 degrees. That's hard to think about. The infrastructure there is so taxed, state officials are asking residents to conserve water or electricity. At the same time, Western Europe is in the grips of a brutal heat wave. London hitting 104 degrees for the first time. And that's not just not normal. That's 30 degrees above normal. 30. The scorching temperatures leading to roads buckling, dangerous wildfires, and sadly, even death. This week, I noticed in all of these places, local officials were warning that the dangerous heat is becoming our new normal. I went to our experts on the WRAL weather team to put North Carolina's temperatures into context. Here's meteorologist Kat Campbell with a brief explainer.
Lena, let's talk about how the heat has impacted us here in the Triangle this summer. Meteorological summer is considered June, July, and August. When you look at summer to date, it has been the third warmest on record here at the Triangle and the sixth warmest July to date. And just look at the colors on our calendar. This is the calendar of high temperatures. The peak of the heat this summer, July 6th and 7th, when we hit 102. We broke a record there. But look at all the orange and the yellow. That is near or above normal temperatures. Only 2 days this month with below normal temperatures. And we've seen 41 days so far this year with highs at or above 90-degree days. Remember, it is only mid-July, so we have more days to go. We're likely to surpass the yearly average. The all-time record, though, 91 set back in 2010. Bottom line here, it has been a very hot summer, so we'll keep an eye on these numbers as we continue through meteorological summer. But let's talk about why it has been so hot recently, especially across the southwest and the central part of the country. But we have to take it in 3D here. So this is what we call a ridge of high pressure. This is happening in the upper levels of the atmosphere, not at the surface. And we often refer to this as a heat dome because in 3D, it really is a dome of high pressure. And wherever this dome of high pressure sets up, that's where we have sinking air. And that sinking air compresses the air and it allows temperatures to really heat up. And we've seen this big area of high pressure just to our west. That's coming our way for the weekend with highs likely to climb back into the upper 90s. Lena.
Ooh, all right. Thanks so much to Kat for that. Tonight, we have a fantastic panel to help us better understand what's going on with our climate. Dr. Kathy Dello is the state climatologist of North Carolina and the director of the NC State Climate Office. Anya O'Flaherty is co-director for infrastructure and development with the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. Dr. Elizabeth Lossis is a senior fellow at Duke's Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. And David Neal is a senior attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center. Hello to you all. Thanks for joining us. So, Dr. Dello, we got a little bit of a breakdown there from Kat about why we're seeing such high temperatures. But I wondered if you could really break down the science about what's happening right now in our country.
Yeah, so not just our country, but our planet. So we're adding heat-trapping gases to the atmosphere and the planet's warming. The planet is warmed about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, and we don't live in the global average, though. We live here in Raleigh or we live in London. So we're seeing some of these extremes pop up. And as Kat said, some really relentless heat this summer. So as we turn up the temperature on our planet, we're turning up the temperature here in North Carolina as well.
You know, I heard a New York Times reporter say something that was really interesting this week. It stayed with me. She said that Europe is living in the climate future now. What does that mean? And do you agree with it?
I agree. So you talked about a new normal, but this is anything but normal, and we're going to pass this. And 2022 is going to be one of our coolest summers on record of the 21st century. So when we get to 2080, 2090, we're going to look back at some of these days this year and think fondly of those cooler temperatures.
Oh, ooh, that's hard to think about. Let's bring it back to North Carolina for a bit. Ms. O'Flaherty, who suffers most in terms of communities from these heat waves?
I think we can say the usual suspects in terms of vulnerability. It's the folks who've been left out of the system in its creation, right? We think here at North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, we work with a lot of rural communities whose infrastructure hasn't been built for this. But it's not just a urban-rural divide. We like to move in that thought, but that's not the actual reality. Urban areas, there are definitely Black sections of town that here in Durham, where I'm living, that haven't seen the same infrastructural investments, and from their onset, they lost tree canopy when their developments were made. So there's no natural cooling from tree cover to allow roads to not heat up as much, to allow buildings to not heat up as much. So infrastructurally, there's all the folks who usually get left out are absolutely the ones who are going to be suffering the most from this.
In what ways do they suffer right now?
So as I said just now, you're seeing the impacts higher every time. So if I'm thinking about, again, Durham as a very easy example, if you're looking at historically white neighborhoods, lots of tree canopy that allows you to actually weather the storm of heat, weather the heat wave a lot more efficiently with a lot less energy burden than other areas. So it's not just about the actual feeling on your body of the heat, is actually the feeling of your pocketbook, right? It's, the energy burden is very real in these communities. And then, our quick solutions around just give everyone an AC, that it costs money to run that AC. When your electricity bill is at 30% and higher of your income, that's not gonna be the solution that necessarily works for you, and you have to make some tough decisions. And then on top of that, you're talking about neighborhoods that, economically advantaged demographics can turn to their ACs, and who gets disadvantaged by that? By the electrical grid being overloaded by folks, using their ACs. It's areas that will get brownouts first. So I'm again thinking to rural areas. Again, I'm thinking to Eastern North Carolina and Appalachian areas, and also the areas where the power stations are, who have to deal with the emissions associated with our stronger draw on electricity to cool ourselves. We just have to think more system-wide.
It's interesting, though, to understand the economic impact and the fact that not having tree cover means that these communities are likely using more electricity. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres offered a really stark warning this week. Most people didn't even hear this on the news, and I wanted you all to take a listen.
This has to be the decade of decisive climate action. That means trust, multilateralism, and collaboration. We have a choice: collective action or collective suicide. It is in our hands.
Dr. Losses, when some people hear warnings like this, it sounds alarmist. We know the UN released the most comprehensive climate report to date, and it essentially said that climate change can't be stopped, but we can tamper its worst effects by changing our behavior as a globe. Do we know what policies work? You're muted. Still muted. There you go.
Sorry. It might sound alarmist, but anybody who watched the news that you just put up on the screen realizes that, in fact, it's only going to get worse. And he's exactly right that this is the decade for action. And what we do or don't do this decade is going to matter. So it needs to be addressed at the global level, at the national level, at the state level, and at the local level. And if we can't coordinate actions at all those levels, we're not going to make it. The interesting thing about what we're seeing now with all these extreme events around the world is this may be what it takes to spur action at our national level and at the global level. Interestingly, while we think of our country as very polarized on issues like climate change, the issue of building climate resilience, of protecting communities, of not spending money on infrastructure that is going to be immediately at risk, for example, of flooding or destruction from sea level rise. Nobody wants to do bad investments. And there is a huge support for that. 85% of the country in the US actually wants the federal government to be more engaged in, for example, smart, climate-proof. That means building for the future we know is already coming. So I think that we actually can take this moment to mobilize the national and global and local forces we need to take immediate action at all these different levels.
I want to talk about specific policies that work. We just have to take a quick break, and I'll ask it on the other side.
When you see a WRAL certified accurate forecast, you know it's been verified by the largest team of meteorologists with the most powerful tools in North Carolina.
We personally write every alert and send them directly to you so that you'll always know when severe weather is at your doorstep.
Tracking severe weather or everyday weather, no matter where or how you watch. Always local, always live, always protecting what matters to you.
And that's coverage you can count on.
Welcome back. We are talking about the scorching heat wave in the Northern Hemisphere and what this says about our changing climate. Last fall, Governor Cooper signed a major new energy law designed to cut greenhouse gas emissions from Duke Energy's power plants by 70% by 2030. We know the devil's in the details, but first, Mr. Neal, can you explain why this is an important goal?
Well, it's an important goal because that's what North Carolina needs to do to match our commitments under the Paris Climate Accords. So not just meeting the 70% reductions by 2030, but reaching net zero or zero emissions by 2050. That's what North Carolina needs to do to do our part. And it is important what we do here. It's both a global problem, but what we do in North Carolina is an important part of the solution.
Not everyone is agreeing, though, about how to go about that in North Carolina in terms of what types of energy to invest in, renewable energy versus natural gas, which we know also is a fossil fuel. Where do you fall on that debate?
Well, our organization, on behalf of a number of clients, the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, the Natural Resources Defense Council, Sierra Club, working with other partners, the Sustainable Energy Association, we've put forward a no regrets pathway that relies on rolling out clean energy in the short term and not relying on new polluting fossil fuel infrastructure, not relying on new gas plants, relying heavily on energy efficiency. Anya was right to point out the disproportionate energy burdens that our low-income customers are facing. And we need to do more to expand access to bill-saving energy efficiency, making homes more comfortable. Having high-efficiency heat pumps will really help people control their bills and improve indoor air quality. So we need to rely on that efficiency, reduce that energy waste, and deploy solar at scale. That's going to also mean having to build out additional transmission so that we can connect that solar and get that electricity where it needs to go. We're going to have to deploy battery storage to help make that energy available when it's most needed. And we're going to have to start developing wind resources. Those are, I think, the key no regrets choices we can make to guarantee that we can reach those 2030 goals and do it in the most affordable, cost-effective way possible.
Dr. Dello, the UN report that I was talking about set out a timeline on how quickly we need to act. And it said by 2025, we need to, quote, peak our emissions. What happens after that date?
So we have all of the solutions on the table that we need to decarbonize our economy, to move and electrify our grid, to reduce our fossil fuel use. So that's the good news. And thinking about this as just a date when things are going to stop or we are going to be doomed, I think is unhelpful framing. So we have fallen asleep on the bus collectively as a planet, as a society. And when you fall asleep on the bus, you don't stay on the bus forever once you wake up. You get off at the next stop. We need to get off at the next stop. So we need to deploy some of those solutions. We do need to do it. We are running out of time, but thinking in this doom framework, I think, is really difficult, especially for some of our younger people who are dealing with some climate anxiety, and also can leave folks feeling hopeless. So there is still time, and at 2025, things don't just switch off.
You know, I do think that that's the complicated nature of this debate right now, that there doesn't seem to be the urgency among the people who are making decisions, the people who are passing laws, certainly not on the federal level. And yet we're also seeing young people who are attributing everything to climate change. When I'm reading from scientists, well, maybe this isn't actually about climate change. This was just an incredibly hot day. This was just a tornado that happened. How do you kind of navigate that debate?
Yeah, so we see the fingerprints of climate change on a lot of disasters. We see it on these hot days. We see it on flooding. It's lurking in the background, and it's making these events more likely, and it's making them more severe. So when I'm talking with folks, I listen to their individual stories. We'll have folks in Eastern North Carolina talk about flooding from Hurricane Florence. It's something that they hadn't seen before. We'll talk with folks about the heat. It's really relentless. We're used to hot North Carolina days, but this is certainly an abnormal summer, and folks are feeling it. So I listen to folks as well on that, but it's inevitable that climate change is here. It's now, and it's affecting our natural disasters.
Dr. Lossis, this week we learned the Biden administration's ambitious climate legislation is just not going to move forward. He just doesn't have the votes to do it. Namely one vote, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. So instead, he announced some executive actions. What are they, and can they make a difference?
Well, what he announced this week is really just a continuation of what the administration has been doing from an executive standpoint from the beginning. There have actually been 5 different executive orders that have set targets, have focused on equity in our response, have promoted adjusting our financial systems, and looked at trying to build jobs through clean energy and other matters. Specifically, this focused on some of the money that's been being spent on helping communities, particularly disadvantaged and vulnerable communities, be able to get access to resources to address these extreme heat problems like air conditioning, energy efficient air conditioning units, or access to cooling centers to go on these hot days. It also has investments for wind energy to promote further wind energy and several other. These actually weren't new items that were announced, but rather a continuation of what is being done right now, both to reduce our climate emissions, but also to build our energy resilience. And the administration actually is doing more than any previous administration has. It's historic, these levels, but I think as we can see, it's not nearly enough. So they're working very hard to do what they can do within the executive mandates, but it's not enough.
All right, we have to take a quick break. Much more on the other side. Stay with us.
You're just one tap away from severe weather alerts, certified accurate forecasts, and control of the only local dual-pole radar, all on the Triangle's most popular app, designed with you in mind. The WRAL News app. Download it today.
Welcome back. Ms. O'Flaherty, I wanted to start with you on this one. Can you describe the visible, practical ways that climate change is having an impact on North Carolina right now?
Yeah, I mean, the easy answer is everything that we've discussed so far. But I'll go further and say that, when we talk about environmental justice at the network, we talk about it in a very intersectional way. So, we've seen across Eastern North Carolina, for example, confined animal feeding operations are allowed to set up and expand, and they basically wind up with waste practices that affect communities on the front end. And then you wind up in situations where there's a flood or a storm that is beyond past records and overloads the lagoons where waste is stored and kept, and basically winds up messing up the waterways or people's homes. So it's those extreme pieces, but it's also, again, in the everyday, it's the energy burden, it's the it's from the resource perspective. There's just a lot of various levels that folks are feeling it.
Do you feel heard by state officials when you're trying to specifically focus on how climate change is impacting vulnerable communities in North Carolina?
I think we could be heard more and with stronger outcomes. I think we get listened to, and then it's not clear what's happening on the back end. So folks, you know, I mentioned earlier this rural and urban divide. Folks put money where a lot of people are. That's not always the way that things need to happen. We do have to think about the most marginalized in many of these policies that are put forward and measures that folks can take, and we're not doing that. Or rather, the administrations aren't doing that. So yes, there is some listening, but the action is really what counts for us, and it really doesn't show up every day.
You know, Mr. Neal, there are a lot of people who will lose their jobs because of climate policy in our area as well. Person County, home to Duke's Mayo and Roxborough coal plants, and hundreds could lose their jobs with the state's new energy plan. What do you think should be done to help those people?
Well, I do think the principles of a just transition should apply, and that we need to do everything we can to make sure people who are dislocated by the energy transition get the support they need to find jobs in the new clean energy economy. And you know, there's been federal legislation to help assist coal-dependent communities that's never gotten a vote on the floor. So I think that there's much that could be done at that level. It's important to recognize that addressing climate change can also bring so many benefits. I mean, reducing that harmful air pollution will do so much to improve people's quality of life. There's a chance to invest in more affordable housing that's closer to where people live, that is so essential to addressing climate change, because having to use fossil fuels for transportation is another big driver of climate change. Our transportation sector is going to have to be a big part of the solutions going forward. And there's going to be so many new jobs as we build out our clean economy.
And we see VinFast, of course, coming to Chatham County, expected to bring hundreds of jobs and a lot of money to North Carolina. Dr. Dello, let's look ahead. So we've been talking about the current heat wave that we're in, how it's just been a really hot summer. Are you expecting a more active hurricane season? How are we expecting these temperatures to play a role in that?
So we're going into the third year of a La Nina, which is pretty rare, and La Nina tends to be a more active hurricane season. In North Carolina, we know it just takes one hurricane to cause lots of damage, and we are positioned in a place where we can take direct hits from a hurricane, but also from the Gulf as well. So sometimes we'll see things like Tropical Storm Fred, which caused fatal flooding in Haywood County last year. We've had Hurricanes Florence and Matthew and Dorian to look at. We are certainly looking at the tropics and keeping an eye on what could come for us in North Carolina.
And of course, everyone can always depend on our WRAL weather team to cover that very closely. I learned a lot from this discussion. Thank you all for joining me. And for the viewers out there, if you have some ideas about what could be the answer to climate change and how it's impacting North Carolina, I want to hear from you. Email me at ontherecord@WRAL.com. You can find me on Facebook at WRAL Lena Tillett. Stay hydrated out there. Have a good night.
Get breaking news in the palm of your hand with custom push alerts, stories that matter to you, and award-winning coverage. All on the Triangle's most popular app, designed with you in mind. The WRAL News app. Download it today.